All right. Set up over here. Like Amos said, we are in chapter 13. A lot of what you think of when you think of Revelation comes out of this chapter. So it is a pretty dense one tonight. We'll do our best. So we mentioned last time that once we got into chapter 12, we've really hit the second half of the book of Revelation. But there's sort of a shift in tone and concern to a certain degree. And one of the things that we've said a few times is that even more so than before, the second half of Revelation gets very expressly political in its concerns. But I think, especially here, it's maybe helpful to stop and say what exactly we mean by uh, Revelation being political. So when I say that Revelation is going to get very political in its nature, I mean that it's going to um, ask these questions and then critique the answers it gets, which is in the world we live in right now, who has power? How did they get power? And what are they doing with power? So, Revelation, we're going to see starting tonight and really going on to the end of the book, is going to speak very critically of governments pretty broadly. But the Bible as a whole generally speaks positively about the concept of government. So, Paul famously in Romans 13 says that the concept of government itself is ordained by God to encourage good and restrain evil. But obviously, governments in the world really often don't do that. And that was true even in Paul's time when he wrote that. So, if God ordains the government as an institution, how does it turn into something that ends up persecuting God's people like we're seeing here? And according to Revelation, the answer is Satan. That just like in the garden, Satan takes one of God's good designs for the world and corrupts it. So, one more note here, though, to get a little more specific. When I say that Revelation is critical of the government, um, that doesn't just mean the people who are in official roles. That doesn't just mean like individual politicians. Revelation thinks a lot more broadly than that. And it thinks about just entire systems of power that are civic and economic and cultural and political. For Revelation, the wealthy business person bribing a senator is as much government as the senator that he bribes. And the soldier that carries out Caesar's order to harm innocent people is culpable in a similar way to Caesar himself. Revelation is concerned not only with individual powerful people's personal evil, the bad choices individual makes, but it's concerned with systemic evil as well. As I think, at the risk of using some kind of loaded language, the best way to describe what we're getting into here. Um, it Revelation thinks that entire political and economic and cultural systems have been sort of influenced by Satan to become evil. And it makes sense that if humans are fallen creatures and humans are creating these systems of politics and culture and economics, then it follows that those systems are also going to be fallen to some degree, and to some degree also in need of redemption. And this is the reality that the next half of Revelation is really going to be concerned with. The way that Satan works in the world through systems of power, and the way that God will ultimately overcome that evil. So, that said, is sort of the themes of the next section. Let's get into chapter 13. So, last week in chapter 12, we talked about the story about um, Satan as a dragon persecuting, trying to eat up this pregnant woman who was about to give birth, but he failed to do so, and he got thrown out of heaven, and he was thrown down to the earth. And that point, with Satan, this dragon, being thrown down to earth, is where we start in Revelation 13. So, then the dragon took its stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its head were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads seemed to have a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all the inhabitants of the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. Let anyone who has an ear listen. If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you are to be killed with a sword, then with the sword you must be killed. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So we'll stop there for now. One of Revelation's most famous images, and one of the ones that people get the most fixated on in the book of Revelation, is this beast coming up out of the sea. Um, it's, uh, there's a lot we could say about this, but I think it's helpful to maybe start and imagine, like we've been asking, what would the first audience have kind of thought about this image, and what does the text seem to want us to think about the image? Because really often we come to this text with sort of preconceptions based on other things we've heard, other parts of the Bible, and it's not always helpful. So I mentioned the first week that the phrase Antichrist never once appears in the book of Revelation. That's an example of a thing where culturally we have ideas about the text and import them, and we start reading things like the letter of John's warning about the Antichrist, this false teacher, and we kind of put it over this image from Revelation. And we maybe start to make it into something that it's not trying to be. The short version is the beast here is symbolic of Rome, particularly, but a sort of stand in for empires and governments in opposition to God's will in general. And that I think is pretty well founded within the text. I think the text is pretty clear about the way it wants us to read that, but we need to unpack it a little bit. So the dragon, Satan, comes and he pulls this beast out of the sea. The sea in the Bible we've talked about a few times is very often a symbol for chaos, for darkness. Evil thing come up out of the sea in the Psalms and in Genesis, sort of. It's a sort of symbol for chaos, and the dragon pulls this beast out of it, and he gives the beast his power and authority. So Satan grants this figure the power he has in the world. And we get this vivid description. So the beast has 10 horns and 7 heads, and its horns have 10 crowns. Its heads has blasphemous names, and it's like a leopard. Its feet are like a bear's, and its mouth is like a dragon. So it's a leopard, a bear, a lion. A leopard, a bear, a lion. Like I'm missing one, I don't think so. The 10 horns, the 7 heads with 10 crowns. These images might sound familiar at this point. The 4 images that we have, the animals that make it up, these 4 beasts, are a direct reference to the book of Daniel, specifically chapters 7, verses 2 through 7. In the book of Daniel, which you might know kind of covers a similar context we've talked about a few times, that the book of Daniel is about God's people being taken captive by Babylon and kind of being exhorted to remain faithful in the midst of that. And in the book of Daniel, there's one point in that chapter 7 where God gives Daniel a vision to sort of show him what the fate of Babylon is going to be. And in the vision, he sees a series of beasts, a leopard, a bear, a lion, and I think a dragon, sort of coming one after the other, kind of devouring each other and replacing each other. And God, or the angel here, explains to Daniel that the beasts represent kings of nations that are going to rise up and defeat Babylon, and then rise up and defeat what's going to defeat Babylon, and then rise up and defeat that nation. So each one of them kind of represents a different nation that's going to come in the future in Daniel. So here in Revelation, all of these beasts that represent kings of some sort of foreign empire that's going to come are mushed together in sort of one super symbol, into one symbol for kind of all empires. It's this super monster that represents all the empires. It's all the kings that Daniel saw rolled into one. The other things he has here, that he has the 7 head, the 10 horns, and the crowns, you might recognize are descriptions that are taken from the Lamb earlier in the book, from Christ. The beast in Revelation is kind of set up as, the best word for it is to think, a parody of Christ, or a kind of mockery of Christ. So the lamb, you might remember, had 7 eyes and 10 horns, and each of those horns has a crown. And so now this beast comes up and it puts itself in the place of the lamb. It has the same sort of physical setup to an extent. It looks like it's been slayed, but it's healed, which you might remember the lamb is standing as having been slain. Um, it's given authority by another father figure, right? Like God gives authority to the Son. Like God the Father gives authority to God the Son, to Christ. Satan gives his authority to the beast in the same way, and the beast is kind of this mockery of Christ. Um, and the people begin to worship the beast, and they say things that sound very similar to what the angels and the saints in heaven are saying when they say, "Who is like the beast, and who could stand against it?" They're giving the beast the same kind of praise. So the beast is using biblical images to represent sort of human government standing up against God, and encouraging people to worship it in the way that they should only be worshiping Christ. Um, and then the beast begins to persecute God's people. So there's a really big, important idea going on in the background that I think will help make this picture of the beast make more sense. And that is that this entire chapter, starting here and then in the next section where we get a second beast that comes, is really a sort of coded and dramatic and vivid reference to something we've mentioned a few times, the imperial cult, or the cult of Caesar. So I want to, at the risk of, dumping too much history on you guys or making things too dry and boring, kind of step back and talk about what Rome was like and this cult of Caesar that's kind of getting portrayed here as this beast. Um, so the imperial cult is exactly what it sounds like, or the cult of Caesar. That at this time in this part of the Roman Empire, temples and services worshiping the Caesar, Caesar being a title for whoever was the emperor of Rome at the time, would have these temples and services made for them. Um, Life as a Roman subject was really hard. There was heavy taxation pretty much anywhere you were, heavy taxation that would really often result in uh, famines. So people in cities worked very hard. They often didn't have enough food. People in more agricultural, rural places would get taxed very hard to support Rome. It was a difficult life. There was constant war in the Roman Empire. If you lived anywhere on the fringes and not kind of in the middle of Rome, you were just going to have constant invasions from other armies, or have to put up with the Roman armies kind of coming through your place all the time. It was not the easiest place to live. And the imperial cult was sort of a religious way for Rome to keep morale up through this. So, what was the imperial cult? Um, it was a religion based around a sort of myth, or a sort of founding story about Rome. And the myth sort of went like this. Um, Rome used to be in a golden age where everything was great and perfect. But then things started to go bad. For one reason or another, the people started to not be as good, the leaders started to not be as good, and Rome sort of fell from this golden age and got worse and worse and worse. Um, but now, insert current emperor here, has been chosen by the gods to bring Rome back to its golden age. So everybody needs to worship the Caesar, to worship this emperor. They owe him praise and worship because the gods have chosen him, or the gods have manifested in him to bring Rome back to its glory days. So you might have heard the phrase the Pax Romana, that was a phrase that Augustus liked to use in his reign a lot, that he was bringing a new Roman peace, a new golden age of peace and prosperity for Rome. Um, so it was really common for city officials and wealthy people in towns like the ones that Revelation is written to get really heavily invested in this religion worshiping Caesar. And it makes sense. If you have any sort of political ambitions, if you want social standing, a really good way to do that is to be the most sort of pro Caesar, pro Rome person in the room. And so city officials and wealthy people would very often sponsor temples and festivals to the emperor as a way to gain the emperor's favor. These places would build temples to the emperor, and so then the emperor would send them sort of gifts, or he might make them the place where certain services would be held. It's sort of like one book I had compared it to the way that when the Olympics are deciding where they're going to go, cities will start vying to build the biggest and the nicest stadium, and they'll spend a lot of money doing that. And sometimes, like in some recent high-profile cases, the local people will be actually really negatively affected by these big displays of construction and patriotism and all of this to lure the Olympics. Or when Amazon says that it's going to build a new headquarters or warehouse somewhere, and all the cities vie to give it the best tax breaks. That's the kind of thing that would go on here for building facilities for the emperor, that places wanted to make themselves sort of the most attractive, kind of patriotic, most standout places to Caesar, to the Senate, to Rome in general. And so there was just tremendous political, cultural, and economic pressure to participate in this religion of emperor worship. And that was really exacerbated by the fact that temples in ancient Rome, but especially imperial temples, tended to be general public places where things like markets and places of work would also exist within them. So the places you needed to go in Rome to buy food, to get a job, were very often temples set up to Caesar. Um, I said there was tremendous pressure for people to be associated with it. Rome is, of course, polytheistic for the most part, so it's not like you can't be another religion, but whatever other religions you're observing, you'd better also be participating in this cult of the emperor. To just borrow a few words here from a little bit of an older book called Unveiling Empire, Reading Revelation Then and Now. It's dense, but it's really good. But I thought he explained this well, the way that the imperial cult was not so much a thing that was like mandated legally, everyone had to participate in, but that the culture kind of mandated for people. So he says this: all members of the city, meaning whatever city we're talking about here, were expected to participate in the imperial cult. While there were times and places where participation was an official command, this was not the case in the cities of Asia at the time of Revelation. Rather, there was a social expectation that one would voluntarily participate to demonstrate one's faith in the empire. This is akin to the way that Americans are expected at sporting events to stand while the national anthem is played. There's no law requiring this, but to not do so may cause a great social affront. And then he goes on to jump a few pages. Um, Sanctions were often unofficial in character. If followers of Jesus withdrew from the daily life of the empire by refusing to participate in the imperial cult, they would place themselves outside the bounds of social acceptability. Depending on the prevailing mood of the city at the time, this could result in social ostracism, exclusion from social events, having one's business boycotted, mob violence and lynching, or being reported to the local authorities. So, like we've kind of been talking about for a while, this is the sort of climate for Christians that the Book of Revelation is written in, where there is some degree of official persecution of Christians in some places, but by and large, the culture is really beginning to turn against Christians. And that's why in Revelation, Caesar is likened to this massive beast that speaks blasphemies and devours God's people. I'm pulling up my notes here, but imagine that you're a shipbuilder in, say, Ephesus. So you make your living by working in a shipyard building ships. You're probably not wealthy, so you don't like own a shipbuilding business, but you work on ships. That's how you make your money. You don't have land, you can't farm. You're a shipbuilder. And everyone in Ephesus has to be a member of the Shipbuilders Guild to do that. So if you're not a part of the city guild of shipbuilders, you can't build ships. And building ships is the only way that you can support yourself and your family. Well, imagine that the head of the Shipbuilders Guild has political ambitions, and a Roman senator is going to be coming through town soon. And so he's going to make a big show by having all of the shipbuilders that work for him come to the gate when the senator comes into town and bow down and burn sacrifices to the emperor. Now, you're a Christian, so that would be idolatry, so you don't want to do that. But what happens if you don't do that, if you excuse yourself from this ceremony? So obviously, and the lightest thing is you will lose your job. No question. That is the least possible punishment that's going to happen to you. You are humiliating your boss publicly when he's trying to jumpstart his political career. You will never work in that industry again. You no longer have a way to provide for your family. And that, again, is the least that could happen to you. Maybe your boss decides that he's going to impress the senator by having you beat up for disrespecting the emperor in front of him. Maybe that roughing up ends up going farther than roughing up, as mob violence tends to do. Maybe one of your coworkers is trying to impress the boss, so maybe taking care of you for him is a good way to do that. The point is, it's pretty dangerous to be faithful in the setting that Revelation is written to. The people are facing tremendous economic and social and sometimes physical persecution for not doing these things that are just assumed. You live in Rome, you live in a Roman city, you're going to do these things. And so, in this setting where the people are being told either you don't have to, deconvert from Christianity, but you have to do this idolatry alongside it, or we're going to take away your livelihood and we're going to beat you up and potentially kill you. Um, it's not that surprising that the way that Revelation, this vivid, picturesque text, portrays Caesar, the object of worship, is a terrible, multi-headed beast that puts itself in the place of Christ, even though it's not Christ. Um, Another reason, just as an aside, that we can read this, I think, pretty straightforwardly as being really having the Roman Caesar in mind and really being kind of for all government in particular, is that this passage and several others in Revelation are going to continue to make pretty explicit references to the Caesar Nero. So let's talk about him for just a second if you're not too worn down with Roman history yet. Um, Nero is referenced in this text that bit about the beast having a head that looked like it was wounded, but the fatal wound had healed. Like we said, that's sort of its parody, its defunct version of the lamb standing as though it's slain. But most scholars also think that this is a fairly direct reference to the Emperor Nero. Nero had died about 40 years before Revelation was written, likely. Um, but there was a myth going around that still persisted to this day that Nero hadn't actually died, and that actually Nero was had only faked his death and was going to come back one day and retake Rome and kind of remake the good days for Rome. Sort of a Elvis Presley type scenario. A lot of people believe Nero was not really dead. He was just regrouping somewhere outside of Rome, and he was going to come back and get vengeance on his political enemies and take Rome back. And so a lot of people think that the fact that this beast that's a stand-in for Caesar looks like it's like been wounded fatally, but not really, is a kind of point at Nero. Now, like we said, Nero was not the emperor when Revelation was written. It's not clear. A lot of emperors in Rome, especially at this time, didn't have especially long tenures, and so it's not very easy to say who the Caesar was during this time. But it definitely wasn't Nero. He had died 40 years earlier, so the relationship in time to Revelation to Nero was like us to Jimmy Carter. But he's referred to a few times in Revelation because John sees Nero as a kind of stand-in for all Roman emperors because he was the worst from a Christian and Jewish perspective. Nero seems to be the first emperor, and one of not a big number to be honest, but the first emperor to have ordered the persecution of Christians personally. Famously, Nero scapegoated Christians for a fire that had happened in Rome and destroyed a big portion of the city. There's a legend that at one point Nero was burning Christians like torches in his garden during a night party. According to most of the early church, these edicts by Nero to persecute Christians were the reason for both Peter and Paul's death. And he's also the Caesar that oversaw the sacking of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. In general, Nero was not very popular as a Roman emperor, at least among sort of the more elite, and was considered an embarrassment by most of the Senate. But he did, like we said, have a pretty dedicated popular following even after his death. So for Revelation, Nero was kind of a super Caesar that, like the beast, represents kind of all of government or all of government that opposes God's will. Nero is sort of a representative of all of the Caesars, and we're going to see him come up a few more times. But all that to say, the beast here isn't just some one specific figure that we're looking for in the future. The beast is first a reference to Caesar, but then a more broad representative of any powerful figure that puts itself up against God. Um, and so we go on within the text. So the beast orders the persecution of God's people. It seems to win. It wins captivation. And you might also note, if you're reading carefully, that we can say pretty definitively this isn't some single person that's going to come in the future that's being coded here, because of the like the verb tenses here. That this passage uses a mixture of past and present and future verbs, and that's really deliberate. That there's no one single beast coming at some point in the future or that came at some point in the past, but the beast came and the beast has come and the beast is going to come in the future, right? If we read this passage, it's past and it's present and it's future. It mixes the verb tense through. There will be, beast following that. We can talk about that later, but it all comes to a head in chapter 9 or in verse 9, where looking at this opposition that the beast, this stand-in for Caesar and the stand-in for the imperial cult holds, John writes this, quoting from Jeremiah. I should have written this down. It's a quote from the Old Testament. I think Jeremiah. But he says, let anyone who has ears listen. If you are to be taken into captivity you will go. And if anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. Some translations might go a little bit differently with that. It's kind of flexible in Greek, but I think the kind of right way to read this is those sort of passives, that if anyone is to be taken into captivity he will go, and if anyone is to be killed with a sword he will be killed. But what's happening here is that John is basically saying, if they threaten to punish you, don't stop, but accept that punishment. So he's saying that if you are being threatened with imprisonment to worship the beast, go into imprisonment. If you're being threatened with the sword to worship the beast, go to the sword before you worship the beast. It's stark, and he ends it here with saying, here is a call for endurance and faith of the saints. It's a fairly bleak picture here, that Satan has given his authority to something very powerful, and that powerful thing is opposed to God's people. And then, to make matters worse, a second beast comes now. So I'm going to read through the end, almost to the end of the book. Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and it makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound had been healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the signs that it is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image of the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666. So again, just hitting the greatest hits of Revelation. You have the mark of the beast and the number of the beast. And we'll get to those in a minute. But what's going on with this second beast? If the first beast, like we've said, is Caesar, is Rome, The second beast is it's the imperial cult. It's the beast that makes people worship the first beast. So everybody's worshiping that first beast because the second beast convinces them to do it. And we notice the second beast also takes some characteristics from the lamb. It has horns like a lamb, but it speaks like a dragon. Remember, dragons are serpent like in this way of thinking. So it speaks like the devil, or like, I think there's a reference here to the snake in the Garden of Eden. It imitates Christ, but it is not Christ. If the first beast, like we said, is representing Rome, but it's Rome taking the place of Jesus, using Jesus as sort of symbols, but doing it blasphemously, taking Christ's place when it has no right to. This beast, I think, is also in some sense a parody of the church. That like the church convinces like the church bears witness to Christ, and that the church proclaims to the world to worship Christ. This beast proclaims to the world to worship the beast, to worship the not Christ, to worship the stand in. And it does so seemingly convincingly. It says it performs great signs, and then it does things that we might associate with prophets in the Old Testament. It does magic signs. You might remember that in the book of Exodus, there's a point where Pharaoh's court magicians are kind of trying to do these counter signs to Moses, and they do magic. They make a staff come to life as a snake, or things like calling fire out of the sky, or things that Elijah did at one point. So it's again this group that takes kind of the image of the church or the mission of the church, and it twists it. The empire cult is convincing people to worship Caesar in a way that is only due to Christ. It's deceiving this dramatic picture all the people of the earth. It's a widespread cult to come and worship Caesar when they should only be worshiping Christ. And it goes on. The beast not only does signs, but it, in a very famous passage, commands people to take the first beast's mark, its name or its number, and it prevents anyone from buying or selling if they don't have the mark. So, what's going on here? Well, like most things, like everything in this chapter, I really think that the way that this makes the most sense is to read this symbolically and not literally. So, not a future event that's going to happen where some sort of mark is going to be given to people, um, but it's a parody of the lamb sealing the faithful. So you might remember that several times in the book we've had the image that Christ seals his people like a scroll, that Christ has put his mark on people in chapter 7, chapter 5, 2 or 3. We get that image several times of Christ kind of putting his stamp on people and claiming them as his. Well, the beast, Caesar, does the same thing. He claims people as his, even though he doesn't have a right to them. And he persecutes people economically for not taking his mark. Now, in that kind of ancient Roman analog, there's not really a marking ceremony like that. Slaves would sometimes be marked with like their owner's identification. But I still think that it's more of a symbol. I mentioned earlier that economic activity generally would take place in temples and often in the emperor's temple. And that meant that the markets where you would buy food and clothing and basic supplies were very often inside of temples to Caesars. And your place of work, your like guild meeting halls, would often be inside of temples. And in fact, if you wanted to be a part of a guild, if you wanted to have any sort of job, you would often have to have a letter of certification that would be stamped by Caesar. And all these together meant that you would get into situations at times where a person could not buy food without first offering a sacrifice to the emperor. And even if they weren't in a place where you had to sacrifice on going into the temple, you would have a situation where a person that wasn't in good standing with the Roman government might not have the money to buy food or clothing. The economic persecution is really bad and is going to keep coming out here. But I think that's the image here that in a lot of these Roman cities, it was impossible to do business or to buy provisions without in some way participating in the imperial cult. And remember, you're in an ancient city. You're not a farmer. You don't have land that you can farm. You could really be in a lot of trouble if you're in a situation where you can't access either jobs or places to buy things that you need. You're risking starvation. You're risking homelessness and nakedness. And so I think that that is the image here. It's a little specific when it says it takes their mark on their name or sorry, it takes the mark on their right hand or the forehead. But this is also another kind of older biblical image. So you might remember in the book of Deuteronomy, in the sort of prayer that Israel's given, the Shema, very famous prayer. God tells the people to take his law and to think about it night and day and to repeat it to their kids and to talk about it when they're going to bed. And he says to take the law and bind it on your right hand and bind it on your forehead. And there again, it's also metaphorical that you aren't really literally supposed to like write down passages of the law and then put them on a sticky note on your hand or head, but it's saying like keep them on you, identify with them. And so the fact that the spots where God's word is supposed to be kept according to Torah is now occupied with markings from Caesar is again another symbol for idolatry. And so we end then with probably the most famous passage out of Revelation when he says, and this mark, by the way, let him with understanding calculate it. It's a number of, your Bible, most translation will say it is the number of a person. I think that's a mistranslation, and I wish that that would be corrected in more Bibles than it is. The more literal translation, the one I think works better, is it is the number of humanity, or it is the number of people. That's sort of the way it's constructed in Greece. It's the number of humans, and it's the number 666. Or interestingly, if you have a study Bible, you might see a footnote. 616, as some manuscripts say. That's really interesting. There's two different things. So what's going on here? Two things to say about the number of the beast. The first, and I think the least, the less important, is I think it's a pretty clear reference to our friend from earlier, Nero. So in the ancient world and most ancient alphabets, you don't have separate numbers and letters like we do today. And so the way that you would write numbers is with letters having numerical values associated for them. So, A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, that kind of thing. It's called gematria if you see the number in a book somewhere, that letters were used in place of numbers. And that meant that a person's name would also equal a number if you added it up. Maybe you did that with a kid, or have seen someone do it of adding up what, place in the alphabet each letter of your name is, and you come up with something. That was pretty common. I remember when I took a class on Revelation at Truett, our professor showed us a piece of Roman graffiti, something that someone had carved into a wall, where like a teenage boy or young man had carved into a wall, I love the girl whose number is, and I cannot remember what it was, but 419 or something like that. And it was, this cute way of writing her initials or something that no one knows what it means. So your name can only mean one number, but one number could mean any number of different names. So like 2 plus 5, 2 plus 3 is always going to equal 5. But if you see 5, you could get there from 1 plus 4, or 2 plus 3, or 5 plus 0. So that's the problem you have with this type of thing, is that you can kind of make a number mean anything. But that said, if you take Nero Caesar and you spell that out using the Hebrew characters, you get 666, which to me is a bit of a kind of open and shut case here, that the Caesar that was most associated with the persecution of Christians, it said the beast's name adds up to 666. And 666 also happens to add up to Nero Caesar. And I said earlier that some, not most, but some very important old manuscripts of Revelation say 616 instead. That version of 666 Nero Caesar is if you take the Greek spelling and use the Hebrew characters, which would have an N on the end of Nero. Just Greek likes putting in the letter N on the end of things that end with vowels. And so usually the way that you would spell Nero back then would have been Neron if you're on the Greek side of the world. If you're on the Latin side of the world, you don't have that. So if you don't have that last and you take just Nero, Caesar, that's 616. So it seems pretty clear to me that if nothing else, the first people to read and write down this book saw this like kind of open and shut, no question, as being a reference to Nero. So, that might hopefully put an end to some amount of speculation on what 666 means, at least, that it very much means Nero in this context, who again is kind of a stand, and it's a reminder that he's the I keep saying Pharaoh, I mean same kind of thing from their perspective. He's the Caesar that killed Peter and Paul and persecuted the Christians. He's the one that represents the beast. But more importantly, 666 is a symbolic number. We've said that 3 in Revelation, but in the whole Bible, represents completeness and totalness, and that 7 represents perfection. So if the beast's number, his name, is 666, he is complete imperfection. He is the failing counterpart of the lamb. That if the lamb is completely perfect, the beast is completely not that. He's complete imperfection. He's 666. He's complete, the number short of perfection. So that's the symbol that we get here. So thrown a lot of kind of history and overview out tonight, and I guess to kind of try and bring it all back together and maybe put just a little bit of application on it. This chapter of Revelation introduces us to Rome as a monster who's been given power by Satan to trick people into worshiping it like Christ. And because he is a trickster trying to worship people like Christ, he persecutes God's people. And so God's people are constantly being jailed and imprisoned and killed by this being that is trying to take Christ's power. And Revelation is trying to tell us over and over again, it won't work. The beast and the one that empowers the beast, Satan, will be defeated. And by the end of the book, we do get these graphic scenes of the beast being destroyed, of the devil being destroyed with him. But Revelation wants to tell us, in the meantime, things are not good for the church, in the sense that Satan, since he's been defeated, is trying to cause as much damage as possible. And the way he does that is by tricking the world into worshiping something other than Christ. And that thing that is being worshipped other than Christ isn't going to like the people that refuse to worship it. It's a call to faithfulness, and faithfulness in the midst of a certain type of cultural persecution, especially. So writing on this, I've mentioned several times N.T. Wright's commentary that I like very much. This is a little bit of a longer quote from it, but I think this is good. So he says, "We can understand the kind of dilemma faced by those Christians back then. We like to think that we would always choose the reality and reject the parody. But would we? When we ask ourselves where similar key issues emerge and challenge us today, it may not be as clear-cut as we like to think, and it's quite possible that Christians in the first century felt like that too. Does it count as compromise if I use Caesar's coins, even though it has words like the Son of God stamped on it? Is it a compromise if I put my stall out by the side of the road during one of the great imperial festivals to catch the crowd as they are going to the temple, even if I don't go myself? Will it matter if I buy a slab of beef in the market, even though I know it will have been offered up in sacrifice in Caesar's temple up the road? For us, does it matter if we buy a newspaper which openly mocks the Christian faith, even if I'm only going to read it for the sports section? Does it matter if I work for a company that, through one of its offshoots, is cheerfully polluting lakes and rivers and destroying their wildlife? Should I be worried that my bank is a major investor in companies that work in parts of Latin America where labor laws are non-existent, allowing them to get away with virtual enslavement of local populations? These are not the only, and maybe not even the most important questions we face, but it's important to recognize that we too face choices which may or may not be so clear-cut as we would like. We need to pray for discernment to distinguish the reality from the parody and to act accordingly." So thank you all for being here tonight. That is a lot that we went over, but looking forward to our discussion on it.